Good evening, I'm Joseph Dobrian and welcome to my show. This is the second of a two-part show. It's me reading from my new novel, Hardwired, which has just come out, published by Rex Imperator, an independent press. Hardwired is in some ways a prequel to my previous novel, Ambitions. If you'll recall, Ambitions, which came out 2 years ago, was the story of a rather dysfunctional family that lived in State City, Iowa. And the story is told by their nosy next-door neighbor, Andy Palinkas. Now this story, Hardwired, visits this same Andy Palinkas as a teenager, growing up in State City, Iowa in the early to mid-1960s. Now, in last week's show, I read you the first few pages, which indicate that Andy Palinkas, as a teenager, was a really kind of neurotic kid. He was always a little crazy. He was functional. He was able to get through life, but he was weird. And just how weird he was shows up in an evaluation that a preschool teacher wrote about him. Andy, as an old man, is cleaning out his parents' house after his parents have died. And he comes across a box full of documents, one of which is this evaluation written by his nursery school teacher more than 60 years before. And he asks himself, could there be more? Could there be some unbelievably, unspeakably horrible stuff that I did long ago that I have somehow managed to forget? Anyway, here is what Mrs. Winky wrote about me almost 65 years ago. Andy had a stiff, tense manner when he first came to school. He talked with adult mannerisms to teachers or visiting parents rather than to any of the children, usually beginning, "I am the foreman of this ranch," or "I am a fireman," or whatever part he happened to be playing that day. He refused to be called Andy or Andrew Palinkas, bursting into a sort of tantrum of protest if anyone called him by his name, but insisted on being called Mr. Nobody. He spent much of his time walking around soliloquizing about the part that he was playing, occasionally volunteering information like, "I swim with my head out of the water so that I can keep my hat on." He nearly always wore a hat, sometimes one from home, sometimes one he borrowed from another child at school. His parts in the fall were nearly always cowboy parts, and he often rode one of the wooden horses, while Bill C., who liked cowboy play, rode on the other. Beyond this rather accidental relationship with Bill, his relationships with the children were mostly advances toward girls smaller than himself, Elsie, Mary, or Debbie, and at first he would be friendly, following her around, but then he would strike out. When a teacher interfered, he would be coldly angry and threatening. He would sometimes start hitting at one of the girls, saying as he hit, "I know how it feels." He did not hit hard enough to hurt much, but at first he made many children afraid. He did not want to fit into his group's routine, especially at first, but went in and out mostly as it suited his imaginary world. He usually listened to stories and nearly always liked music, taking eager part in rhythm. In playing Little Sally Waters, we had to take special care to call him Big, not Little, but he would sometimes tolerate being called Andy by November. If one of the children said, "You're not a real cowboy," or some such thing, he went into a frantic fury. Much teacher attention went into protecting him from these verbal expressions that seemed to him real attacks on his personal security. All sorts of frustrations made him cry. November 22nd, during music, Andy had been going around with his hands joined in front of him, as in playing elephant. When the group wanted to join hands and play monkey in the chair, he refused to unclasp his hands and so could not join hands in the circle. But he wanted to be in the circle and be chosen. Unable to resolve the dilemma or let anyone help him, he simply cried and jumped up and down. In the first months of school, he not only protested, "I'm not Andy," but also, "I don't have a mother. I'm a young cowboy who doesn't need anyone." He also worked things over, talking to himself at rest, as in, yeah, Andy can't catch me," Mrs. Boy asked him why not, and Andy replied, "Andy's little and bad. He tries to catch me to kill me." At the same time, busy as he was playing his various roles, he was keen and alert about the grown-up world. He always went to talk to new adults who were always much impressed with him, and so often asked him his name, but got no response, or else the answer, "I'm Mr. Nobody." The first time Mrs. Lyons came to sing French songs, she first explained in English what the song was going to be about. Before she had said a word of French, Andy came up to her saying firmly, "Are you an American? You don't sound like one." Note taken February 14th. Andy walks round and round with a valentine he had made earlier in his hand, saying, "I have a valentine," at intervals. He adds, "I want Palenkus written on this valentine." This was the first time I had heard him ask specifically for his own name, though by February he had become willing to let himself be called Andy or Andrew Palenkus in the usual course of daily business. This note also gives a good example of how much more he was able to take part in the other children's play, and how much more he had begun to be accepted instead of being avoided. Ricky N. had brought just 3 valentines to school that day, one for his teacher, one for his best friend, and one for Andy Palenkus. Note March 30th. Mrs. E. came to help at school, and Andy ran up to tell her about his costume. After he and she had talked a little while, she said, "What's your name?" And he answered firmly, without hesitation, "My name is Andy." Okay, about the adult mannerisms first. That's true. All my life, I have had a stick up my butt, you might say. All through my childhood and adolescence, adults would comment on how grown up I acted for my age. I had a much bigger vocabulary than most kids, and maybe I was a little more perceptive than the average, so I could talk about most subjects on a higher level than I might have been expected to. If I did act older than my age, the reason is clear to me. It's because all I ever wanted to be was grown up. I hated being a kid. I hated every second of it. All I ever wanted out of childhood was out of childhood. A lot of people will wax sentimental about their childhood and talk about how wonderful it would be to stay a child forever. A whole industry evolved around that play by J.M. Barrie about a little boy who wouldn't grow up. So when some people talk about how wonderful childhood was, I have to believe that it was for them, not for me. Even today, in my late 60s, I sometimes notice myself tingling at the idea that I'm an adult. It's fun to be an adult. Not fun all the time, but there's more fun to being an adult than there is to being a kid. You can eat pizza whenever you want, or ice cream, or cheeseburgers, for 3 meals a day if you feel like it. You can stay up as late as you want. You can watch anything on TV that you want to watch. You don't have to make your bed. You can get drunk if you want to. On the other hand, consider the various indignities of childhood. The everyday humiliations, the feeling of personal powerlessness, never being taken seriously in your opinions, never having much privacy, having to ask permission to do most things unless you have to do them because you're told to. Is it any wonder that I took such strong exception to being called little? The only mystery to me was why no other kid had a problem with it. That might have been why I always insisted on wearing a hat. Nowadays I have to wear a hat to keep from getting sunburn on my bald head in the summer and to keep warm in the winter. But as a child, I wore a hat because adults wore hats. At least they did back when I was a kid. Having a hat on my head made me feel more like one of them. Did you know, by the way, that if you're ever taken prisoner in a combat situation, you should keep your hat on, or if you don't have a hat, you should improvise one out of a rag or a dirty shirt? Prisoners with hats are less likely to be abused by their captors because a hat is a symbol of power and authority. It's funny how I sensed that, even at the age of 3 or 4. I don't have a mother. I don't need anyone. Well, that was what I hoped and prayed for. That was my fantasy, because the reality, my dependence on adults, was offensive to me. Offensive and oppressive. As for disliking my own name, Palenkus sounded funny, sounded goofy, more like a sound effect than a name, like piss hitting the toilet. Besides, it sounded foreign. It's remarkable that at age 4, I knew what a sound effect was and that I knew the concept of sounding foreign. Now, I didn't object to my surname, though, nearly as much as I hated my given name. Andy was a little boy's name, as I perceived it, and I hated being a little boy. The full name, Andrew, I didn't mind so much, except for the fact that the name identified me. It identified the person I was trying to get away from, the person I was trying not to be, the person I was trying to pretend I wasn't. Andy, you'll recall, was little and bad and trying to kill me. The me he was trying to kill was whatever pleasant fantasy I might have been engaging in at the moment. I don't mean to say that there was an alter ego named Andy who was trying to get me to stop the fantasies or the role-playing or whatever you want to call it. No, what was killing me was the knowledge that I was, after all, just Andy, a stinky 4-year-old who was little and bad. That was the Andy who was getting in the way of my fantasy of being a cowboy, a soldier, a fireman, an adult. Me was what I wanted to be. Andy was the horrible reality of what I was, little and bad. That's why I would go into a frenzy if someone suggested that I wasn't really whatever I was claiming to be. Because to deny the fantasy, deny the reality of my fantasy, was to remind me that it was a fantasy, and that the reality was that I was little and bad. Mrs. Winkie remarked that I acted as though these suggestions constituted a threat to my personal security. Yes, that's exactly it. The girls, I wanted to show affection. Even at that age, I was susceptible to pretty girls. The only way I knew how to express my attraction was to walk up to them, talk to them, touch them, follow them around, and demand that they pay attention to me. I resented it when they rebuffed me. I took it as a rejection of me as a human being, rather than discomfort with my behavior. It made me furious. Well, of course I frightened the girls. I understood at the time that I frightened them. I hated it. That was the last thing I wanted to do. But at the same time, I recall I felt a perverse satisfaction, knowing that if the girls didn't like me, at least they were afraid of me. I wasn't angry at the girls, though. Maybe it looked that way, but it seems to me that if I had actually been angry at them, I would have hit them harder, tried to do some damage. I'm not so sure that I was angry at myself either for a situation that I didn't believe I could help. Angry at my creator, maybe, whoever that was. Angry at the forces of nature, at fate. The best explanation I can come up with is that I was angry at whatever agencies had acted or conspired to make me so unappealing. Lord knows I didn't blame the girls. I knew how disgusting I was. The crying. That was my standard reaction to practically anything I didn't like. I would cry in reaction to actual threats on my personal security, but also in reaction to frustration, to any feeling of injustice or disappointment. I was disappointed easily, and I felt injustice keenly. Now, once, this may have been a year later when I was in kindergarten, a bunch of kids got to picking on another kid, not me, on the school playground. Nothing violent. We were playing a game, tag or something, and Everett, I can't forget his name, Everett wanted to play, and some of the kids didn't want to include him. He was this fat, dumpy kid, seldom very clean, never in nice clothes. The other kids were shouting unkind words at him, chasing him away from them, making him run and cry. I was there, and I started to participate. Not because I had anything at all against this kid. I actually kind of liked him. But because everybody else was doing it, and this was my opportunity to be one of them. Moreover, I had never before been on that end of such a transaction. I was curious to see what it would be like. I'll admit it, for a moment it felt good. That sense of belonging, that sense of being one of the gang, the realization that at least for that moment I wasn't the lowest kid on the pecking order. For a second it felt good, maybe for 2 seconds. Then I caught the look in Everett's eyes, the fear, the perplexity, the amazement at this sudden, capricious, unreasoned cruelty, this utterly unjustified cruelty. I cannot forget that look. More than 60 years later, I still can't think of the look on Everett's face without feeling physically sick and wishing that I could go back in time to comfort and befriend him. That's another thing I hate myself for. I didn't have the courage to tell those other kids to ease up. Probably I couldn't have made it stick, or could I have? Might it have been as simple as planting myself in front of Everett and saying, okay, enough? Too late to know now. But at least I resolved never again to join in that kind of behavior. And I'm racking my brain as I write this to be certain that I can't think of another instance in which I partook of group bullying. I find it hard to believe that I never did it again, but I'm pretty sure it's true that that was the first and last time. Now, up to age 6, children can be cruel, but they're usually not vicious enough to take advantage of one kid and make him a perennial scapegoat. By age 7 or so, they are. When you were a kid, did you notice how usually starting in the 2nd grade, one kid will become the butt of the whole class? And it's usually mostly his fault. It's not necessarily his fault that he's unattractive or fat or has poor eyesight or whatever, but you need to know this. You need to believe and understand this. That kid is never blameless. There is always a reason why the butt of the class, and it's usually a boy, but not always a reason why the butt of the class gets picked on, and it's always something he could work on, at least, if not eliminate. He might have a disagreeable personality, he might have an uncontrollable temper, he might have poor personal hygiene, he might be weak and ineffectual to the point where the other kids just plain lose patience with him. Whatever the reason, if he is the picked-on kid, it's going to be his fault to some extent. That's a fact we have to face if we are ever going to consider the matter rationally. It's maybe not his fault that he has some defect or other that makes him a target, but it is his fault if it's something he could at least try to change, and he doesn't. It is his fault if he can't or won't come up with an effective way to resist or cope with other kids' behavior toward him. Almost every child at that age gets picked on a little by other children. It's part of growing up. Most kids learn how to handle it. But the kids I grew up with learned quickly enough that if I got picked on, I would cry. This was partly because I feared I might be in physical danger, but mostly I cried at the injustice of it, being attacked by kids who, so far as I could reason, I had never offended. By crying, I gave them more reason to pick on me. Making me cry was apparently fun. Thus, my chief memory of 2nd through 6th grades is of walking to or from school 4 times a day with a squad of other children walking backwards in front of me, chanting, pointing, laughing. You know what I think is the reason why I couldn't rid myself of this habit of crying? Because it was my coping mechanism. Cry and get an adult to intervene. Cry and maybe people would try to appease me. Cry and use the tears to isolate myself from the rest of the group. This is all hypothesis. But my habit of crying at the least provocation persisted, and it made my life hell. It was something I told myself I couldn't control, although there must have been a way I could have done it. Anytime I felt insulted or slighted or felt that I was being treated unfairly, my eyes would smart and tears would come however I tried to stop them. I knew it was unmanly. I knew that if I wanted to consider myself a grown-up, I would have to stop with the crying somehow. But it wasn't until adolescence that I was able to get the tears under some control. Okay, I was lachrymose. That wasn't all that was wrong with me. I have always been a little heavy. Not grossly fat, but always slightly to moderately chubby. In my teen years, I wasn't all that fat because I had gotten my height, and I have done my best to stay in not too bad shape now that I'm old. But as a pre-adolescent kid, I was fat. There's no getting around it. Fat kid is candy to other kids. For another thing, I had and have defective feet that made it impossible for me to run fast or jump high. I was born with severely flat feet, with ankle joints so loose that my feet actually flop around on the ends of my legs. There's no tension in my ankles at all. So I have never been able to run with any speed. If I had to run to save my life, I would be out of luck. I can't do more than waddle, which, as you might imagine, made me a bit of a liability on the baseball field or the basketball court. To this day, even simply walking is a conscious process for me. That is, I appear to walk normally, but because of my condition, I have to think to walk. I have to pay attention as I place one foot in front of the other, or I will kick myself. That's why, as an adult, I often wear cowboy boots instead of shoes, even when I'm dressed for business. The high shaft of the boot acts as a sort of exoskeleton, a brace that keeps my foot on the straight and narrow. As for jumping, forget about it. I couldn't get myself more than a few inches off the ground. I was such a hopeless athlete that when the neighborhood kids chose up sides for a game, I wasn't merely picked last. No, it was worse than that. It was, if we have to take Palinkas, then you have to give us... And finally, I was a coward. Even when I was playing with other kids without being picked on and made to cry, I would invariably hang back when they engaged in any activity that looked at all dangerous, which made me even less a part of the gang than I already was. About the time when it was coming clear to me that I was weak, cowardly, and a crybaby, it came equally clear that my mother didn't like me. Maybe she did like me when I was very little, but after a few years, I had made myself so disagreeable that I don't blame her if she didn't. As Mrs. Winkie suggested in that evaluation she wrote, I did like to put myself forward as long as I wasn't placing myself in any physical danger. I liked to make people notice me, to show off. That probably embarrassed Mom. Maybe that's what she meant when she told me I was selfish. That was the most awful word that Mom could think of to call anyone, selfish. And I got a lot of selfish when I was growing up. I wasn't selfish in the sense of greedy, but I certainly was always at the front of my own mind, so maybe I was selfish in that way. What I wanted in putting myself forward was the respect and deference I believe that I would have gotten if I had been grown up. I resented the whole idea that I was a child. You could say that the story of my childhood was my long succession of efforts and failures to deny my childhood and be an adult. Chapter 2, my family. It surprised me when Dad, a few months after Mom had died and just a few months before he followed her, told me that I would be the executor of his will. I had expected him to appoint Mark. Traditionally, it's the eldest son's duty to execute his deceased father's will, but I figured that in this case, an exception would probably be made. Mark is 2 years younger than I am, and he's well known internationally as a physicist. I'm pretty sure that if Dad had died first, Mom would have made Mark her executor. My dad, Steve Palinkas, Istvan was his baptismal name, but he was always Steve, grew up in Pittsburgh in the 1920s and 30s. It must have been a hard scrabble for him, but he was a bright and popular kid, the way he told it to me, and he did whatever work he could find when he wasn't in school. He was a go-getter, although not excessive about it. He was president of his senior class in high school. He once told me, I was never a big student government type. I just got elected because I was well-liked, if I say so myself. That must have been true because if Dad was anything, he was likable. When I was in high school, he was in charge of the Farmers Midwest Mutual office in State City. When you're in the insurance business, you have to put in a lot of face time with your clients, so you had better be likable. Dad was good at remembering names. He was friendly and cheerful. Even when I was a little boy, Dad impressed me because it seemed that other people invariably liked him. Dad looked like Jerry Stiller, the comedian, with the marcelled Hungarian hair, the sharp features, and the little mustache. I don't know where my balditude comes from because Dad kept his hair all his life. I didn't. Dad's eyes were hazel brown, and one of them was glass. His right eye had been virtually sightless from birth and prone to infections, so when he was a teenager, the eye had been removed surgically. Dad had a way of cocking his head when he was interacting with people. so that he could look at them out of his good eye. And this head tilt made people think that he was being particularly courteous and attentive, which was probably one reason why he was liked. It also made him look very stern and authoritative when he wanted to. His having one eye was just a characteristic. I never gave it any thought, except in connection with the fact that on account of that eye, Dad hadn't had to serve in the armed forces. When I was a kid, World War II was a recent memory, and most of the other kids I grew up with had fathers who had served. A lot of those men had stories, which I loved listening to whenever I got the chance. Dad didn't have any of those stories, which diminished him a little, diminished the esteem in which I held him just a little teeny bit. Not in a big way. I expect most kids are ashamed of their parents for one thing or another, or embarrassed by them. But in general, I was rather proud of my parents. And this was just a tiny point against Dad, made even smaller by the fact that it couldn't have been helped. I knew he wasn't to blame, but I just wished growing up that Dad had had some war stories of his own to compete with those that the other fathers in the neighborhood could tell. But he had stayed in college during the war, University of Wisconsin, and when he graduated, he went right into business, even though the war would still go on for another year and a half. He got married, too, to his college sweetheart. Mom looked like Mrs. Olson, the Folgers coffee lady. Scandinavian, nearly 6 feet tall, blonde, with very light green eyes. She was good looking, but aside from her height, she didn't stand out because she didn't want to. Päivi Dahlgren Palinkas. Probably, if anyone remembers her at all, they remember her for being so quiet and soft-spoken around other people. She had a bit of an inferiority complex. No, check that, she had a lot of one. People would remark that she had an extremely pretty smile, and she did. Those same people would almost always add that she was so modest and unassuming. When she was alive and after she died, both, people would tell me so often what a wonderful, sweet person my mother was. So gentle and kind. And at that point, I think we're going to break off. You've seen my parents. You haven't really met them yet. That is, my parents in the sense of Andy, the narrator of this book. In the next episode, I'm going to introduce you to Andy's parents, or rather, Andy is going to introduce you to his parents and to his grandparents. And you'll see a little of how Andy grew up in Waukesha, Wisconsin, before he moved to State City, Iowa. That's all on the next version of the next episode, that is to say, of the Joseph Dobrian Show. We are reading my latest novel, Hardwired, which is available on my website, josephdobrian.com. It's available at Prairie Lights Books in downtown Iowa City. It's available on Amazon.com, and you can get it from my publishing house, Rex Imperator. Their website is rex-imperator.com. Again, it's Hardwired by me, Joseph Dobrian, and I'd appreciate it if you bought a copy. So we will talk again next week. In the meantime, I'm Joseph Dobrian. Thank you very much for tuning into this show. Good night.